The Print Off The Cuff, presented by IIFL Wealth and Asset Management, corporate partner AU Small Finance Bank, airline partner SpiceJet.
It's my great honor and privilege to welcome to Off the Cuff John Chipman, Director General and CEO of International Institute for Strategic Studies. It's also like Guru Purnima, the day when you say thank you to your gurus in India. So I can tell you also that almost 30 years back, 29 years back, when I was a research associate at International Institute for Strategic Studies in London, John supervised my Adelphi paper, and that paper foresaw the rise of the BJP. So John, thank you very much. Guruji, you were a guru for that. But you are a guru, you are a strategic guru in the world. So tell me something. Is anybody winning or losing the war in Ukraine? And if nobody wins or loses, what will happen?
Well, in the famous phrase, it's a bit too early to tell. What I think was surprising to Putin and what was surprising also to the United States and others was that he didn't win very quickly at all. He lost the battle for Kyiv that he expected to win in 3 days, and then he retreated after a few weeks to the Donbass. He lost Snake Island, that important strategic small piece of real estate in the middle of the Black Sea, and he offered a goodwill gesture of retreating for humanitarian purposes. But the devastation in Ukraine has been huge, and the challenge has been on the Western side to ensure that the balance of power is shifted so that Ukraine can win, but not so much in that Russia decides to escalate. And this has been the psychological and strategic dilemma that the West has had in dealing with this issue.
I track your writings, not just on Twitter, and I know that you would rather that the West stops being awed by Putin's threat of escalation and call his bluff, so to say, and escalate on Ukraine's side. You don't see the risks in that?
A war is not risk-free, but what is risky is to let Russia win in Ukraine and get onto the borders of NATO. He has collapsed the European security architecture. If that security architecture were not collapsed, Finland would not have changed a 75-year tradition of joining NATO. This has been the ultimate strategically non-aligned country until they entered the EU, but we're still militarily unwilling to join the NATO alliance to perturb Russia. So that is a risk. I think the two problems that the West has had is that at the very beginning of the conflict, they said, we have no NATO Article 5 commitment to Ukraine because Ukraine was not a NATO member state. But what the West could have said is simply, we do have a UN Article 51 right to defend a country that has been the subject of aggression, the same way we did when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. The West was then concerned that the Middle East strategic order would be disturbed, that the next stop would be Saudi Arabia. So even without any treaty commitment, but because of UN Article 51, they went in. And I think the challenge that the Biden administration unfortunately gave itself was to thermostatically control their relative increase of assistance at each stage, hoping that that wouldn't lead to escalation. But if it's true that we don't want a war with Russia, it's equally true that Russia doesn't want a war with NATO. So I think we could have been a bit braver. And I think as each week has passed, in fact, things that were thought impossible 6 weeks ago are now being done.
That's a new Chipmanism, thermostatically control. Just elaborate on this for 1 minute.
In 60 seconds, what I mean by thermostatically controlled is that in the early days of the conflict, when the Ukrainians were asking for a piece of weaponry from the United States in particular, there was a large interagency discussion between the Pentagon, the State Department, and other branches of government. Would the delivery of this weapon be defensive or offensive? And if offensive, could that lead to escalation? Whereas in fact, in defense, you need to be able to counterattack. And so you need offensive weaponry in order to be able to defend territory that you're trying to recover.
And you don't counterattack necessarily by entering the other guy's territory. You should have the ability to attack within his territory from a distance.
Well, exactly. And I think one of the issues that arose only about 3 or 4 weeks ago was when the United States decided to deliver some long-range artillery. But they said you can only use this long-range artillery to hit Russian positions that are geographically within Ukraine. And if you think of that, it means that if the Russians were to retreat 1 mile into Russian territory and still send artillery shells 50 miles into Ukraine, they would immunize themselves from counterattack, and they would only put themselves in a vulnerable position if they crossed the border by 1 mile. So clearly that is unstrategic, and some counterattack into Russian territory will be necessary, so long as the purpose is not to occupy Russian territory, but only to defeat the aggression.
Or to attack Russian civilians, or
Absolutely.
which is not stopping the Russians from doing the same to Ukrainians.
Well, what one could say is that after 4 or 5 weeks of being frustrated in Ukraine, Putin may have drawn the conclusion that if he can't have Ukraine, then neither can the Ukrainians, because the civilian bombardment of hospitals, of city centers, of children's schools has been wholly indiscriminate and purposely so. And that's a tragedy here that also in the West in the past, we used to speak about the so-called responsibility to protect, a doctrine that was raised when we intervened in the civil war in Yugoslavia and later in Libya. But the responsibility to protect doctrine seems to have been less applied in this instance. And I think that worries a lot of Europeans.
Were you surprised by the way the Ukrainians fought back? Did you think for a moment that Zelensky will run away like Ghani in Afghanistan?
I think the two things that were interesting here was everybody knew that the Ukrainians had the political will to fight, and that the whole Ukrainian population, with the exception of some recidivists in the Donbass, of course, want to defend their territory. Everyone equally knew that between 2014 and 2022, they had trained quite well with Western suppliers, that they had improved their armed forces. At the very beginning, the Americans and the British, in the period between mid-February and February 24th, when the aggression started, but when the UK and the US had all this signals intelligence that it was Putin's intent to attack, there was a lot of inquiry of the Ukrainian military, what is your plan? And they didn't say anything. And so the feeling in the United States and the United Kingdom was perhaps they're not prepared. But in fact, they had a plan, but they were keeping it even secret from their own best friends. So this was a military that was organized and ready to fight, even as Zelensky was saying, we don't think the war will actually begin.
So when you say they probably had a plan that they weren't sharing with their allies also, what was the plan? Because that's now played out.
Well, first of all, I think there was some concern for operational secrecy to ensure that they didn't talk too much about it, given their own concern about the leakiness perhaps of their own structures. But clearly, they had enough information about Putin's initial aim to grab the airport near Kiev and then be able to move into Kiev from there. And they completely ambushed the Russians in those early days. And that was the first disillusion of Putin's, because the feeling was that within 3 or 4 days, he might be able to take the capital, Kiev, and then install a puppet government. And remember, in the weeks leading up to February 24th, the British and the Americans were releasing intelligence, which was even naming the names of people that Putin was intending to install as his puppeteers or puppets in Kyiv. And I have a Chipmanism phrase for this, if you'd allow me, which is to say that there was an attempt of deterrence by preemptive attribution. So what the Americans and the British were trying to say by giving all these information away was to deter them from doing what we were now saying we knew that they were going to do. And I think to some extent that did surprise the Russians, that we knew so much of their intent, if not necessarily about their actual capability.
So we'll now note the second Chipmanism today, doctrine of deterrence by prior attribution.
By preemptive attribution.
Preemptive attribution. That's a good one. That's a good one. That's why it's so wonderful to have a chat with you. Now, Putin, look at the picture from his side, because there are two sides fighting the war. He took these big knocks. These were knockout punches, losing the best of his fighting forces, the cream of the Russian military might in Hostomel at the airport. His best commandos, his best equipment, his best tacticians. And then being shown up to be so competent with this convoy all lined up. They were actually inviting ambushes in times of beyond visual range weapons. And in fact, even within visual range missiles, shoulder-fired missiles. So first of all, did that incompetence surprise you, that how can you move such a huge body of armor and mechanized forces without any infantry to secure them?
I think that was one of the reasons that some of the military specialists in late February were saying that he didn't look like he was ready to invade. So while the signals intelligence was that he had the full intent, you had some very well respected military specialists who were saying, yes, but we're not seeing the field hospitals, the fuel depots, the support that one would normally expect to see for an army of occupation that would clearly need to fight for several weeks in order to achieve its aims. And that's why they were looking at this deployment of forces and saying, this is not a force of occupation that is being developed. So that was a mystery. And I think the only way the mystery can really be explained is that he wasn't even telling his own people what he was doing, that many of the forces that were deployed along the border of Russia and Ukraine and from Belarus and Ukraine genuinely believed that they were on exercise, that they would be going home in a few days' time. And then suddenly they were told that they were going in to invade Ukraine. And this was also the operational secrecy that no doubt Putin, to his cost, was trying to maintain. So convinced was he that the Ukrainians would, at least to a degree, receive him with not open arms, but acceptance.
That they will be hit by shock and awe just by looking at his buildup. Because this world is known from, since Waterloo, if not prior to that, that you don't send cavalry out without infantry.
Yes, there's a lot of mystery about the fact that the Russians didn't even follow their own doctrine, as some of the military experts say, that when you read the doctrine, they have a sensible doctrine about how to use military forces, but also that they weren't really as capable as they should have been in a sort of combined forces operation. And there wasn't that coordination between their ground forces and their air power that you would normally expect in a sophisticated military.
Yeah, because Russians are known to use massed artillery, which is what they're doing now. But they didn't even have it ready when they thought they were going for a drive-by in Kyiv. That's a big surprise.
And I think it was a surprise also to some partners in Asia, in particular China. I think there is a safe presumption that when Putin was in Beijing for the Olympics, he explained in broad terms his intent and implicitly gave an assurance to President Xi that this would not last too long. So I think the Chinese even are a little bit alarmed as to how long this operation has lasted.
Yeah, so I'll keep on taking some questions from our subscribers and viewers and friends. Otherwise, you and I will be talking for the entire hour. So this is Jerry Rao, Jaitirth Rao, who was the head of Citibank in India, now is a serial entrepreneur, who wants to know the realist political scientist, he says, his description, not mine, the realist political scientist John Mearsheimer has argued that India did well not to sign the NPT and get nuclear capability. For years, most of my American friends, his American friends, Jerry's, felt that it was correct for the US to keep arm twisting India to sign the NPT. My disagreements were met with disdain. What are your views now? Was India smart?
Well, I think there's a strong understanding in the United States, both as between Democrats and Republicans, that India has its own strategic rationale to have nuclear weapons and to stand apart from an NPT regime of which it wasn't a co-author. I think this issue is strategically no longer really much of a live one. The Bush administration, as you know better than me, had excellent relations with the Indian government of the day and worked closely with it on nuclear issues. And I think there's now an acceptance by all that the Indian strategic stance is a sound one, and that it is possible still to support arms control in a variety of ways without necessarily having been a signatory. So I don't think this is much of a worry now strategically, and it's not an issue that Europeans and North Americans seek to raise with India or feel that they must. In that way, India has achieved a level of strategic autonomy that others would be jealous of.
Well, so as we talked, since you talked about there being an agreement between Democrats and Republicans on India, so just today as we talk, US Congress has passed amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act, giving India a waiver, CATSA waiver on the S-400 purchase. And the vote is 330 to 90. Of the 90, 85 are Republican. So still majority of Republicans have voted for the amendment. But the 5 Democrats who have voted against the amendment, no prize for guessing, these are 5 of the 6 members of what Donald Trump used to call the squad.
Yeah. Yes.
So that's a little factoid. Although the guy who moved the amendment is Ro Khanna, who's very much on the left of the Democratic Party and was heading the Bernie Sanders campaign committee. Now, Sanjay Agrawal, AU Small Finance Bank, is the founder of the bank. Oh, as a banker once again. So how do you see the impact of Russia-Ukraine war on the global economy in general? And developing economies in particular, and where do you see India being affected? Economically, so I would add strategically also.
Yeah. So here are 3 thoughts on that. First of all, Russia has unilaterally closed the Black Sea. And I think one of the things that European countries, perhaps collaborating with 1 or 2 countries from outside Europe, should have been able to do and should still think of doing is to reopen the Black Sea, to send a frigate, a destroyer, a couple of minesweepers in through the Black Sea on a humanitarian mission in order to demine the area around Odessa and escort some of that 22 million tons of grain outside of the Black Sea. I cannot imagine that if a Dutch minesweeper or an Italian frigate were doing this humanitarian operation, that the Russians would sink a ship that had also implicitly a NATO flag. And that's a sort of example of the military challenge, but for humanitarian purposes, that we should be willing to take on. And why this? Because the number 1 importer of Ukrainian wheat in the world is Egypt, and the number 2 importer of Ukrainian wheat in the world is Indonesia. And much of the global South hugely depends on that. So I think keeping in mind our responsibilities in that area, we should be doing more. On the global economy, clearly the issue of how gas prices are going up and food prices are going up are important. But imagine this other circumstance, which is how do we pay one day for the reconstruction of Ukraine? And there's now a debate in North America and in Europe about moving from freezing Russian state assets to seizing those Russian state assets, which would be about $500 billion worth of cash, much of which could go to the reconstruction of Ukraine. And why is this important? Because the question will be asked, why should the Western taxpayer be paying for the reconstruction of Ukraine? And why should the Western taxpayer be doing that and therefore depriving development ministries in Europe and North America from supporting the global South, because that money has been displaced having to go to Ukraine? For India, I think over time, it will need to consider whether both in terms of its economic links, its political links, its military links, it's a little bit too overweight Russia at present. and needs perhaps to hedge in a different direction.
In fact, this amendment in US Congress also says that we've got to acknowledge that India has a military dependence on Russian equipment going back to history, but US should also encourage India now to diversify. And I think that process is pretty much on right now. John, before I get onto the next question from our many subscribers, and you can see how many of them I have. So we're not going to be able to do all of those. Let me ask you a question. Please demystify for us, this phenomenon called Turkey. How can a ruler get away with doing everything wrong? 75% inflation, getting sanctioned by the Americans for buying stuff from the Russians, buying missiles from the Russians, at the same time aggressively selling drones to Ukraine, which are taking out Russian equipment. Once again, getting involved with Azerbaijan to defeat a Russian protectorate, so to say, Armenia, and now playing this quote-unquote stellar role in hopefully evacuating this grain out of Ukraine. Is it all geostrategic location that Erdogan is leveraging, or is there something else to Turkey?
Well, President Erdogan is a very individual figure in global politics. He has done something quite interesting in the last several months, which is that he has had really bad relations with the countries of the Gulf because of his support for the Muslim Brotherhood,
right.
And as the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia and Egypt in particular, under its current president Sisi, are really very allergic to any support to the Muslim Brotherhood, which of course Turkey was previously championing. And you're right that Turkey has a range of contacts that seem in many ways competitive. But one thing that Turkey has done in the last several months is make up its relations with the countries of the Gulf. So he has gone to Saudi Arabia, he's gone twice to the United Arab Emirates, he received Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia in Turkey in an almost majestic fashion, ruling out his whole parliament and the whole cabinet to shake hands with him. And why this?
Not to forget Israeli president.
And those as well, who have now, of course, a special relationship with at least a few of the Gulf Arab countries, and a quiet one with most of the other Gulf Arab countries. But the reason is that, as you say, the Turkish economic situation is really very poor. So they want now to be seeing Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates to again be investing in Turkey and to receive money there. So the interesting thing is that Erdogan is a supplicant to the Gulf, but now the West is a supplicant to Turkey, because Turkey has the keys to the Black Sea.
Yes,
Turkey has it's got the keys on both doors to the Black Sea, but also additionally, they hold the 30th key for the accession of Finland and Sweden to NATO. All 30 present NATO countries need to ratify. Turkey gave permission, as it were, for the accession process to proceed. But while there have been 15, 17 countries so far to ratify, one can be sure that Turkey will be the last one, and then we'll see some more bargaining from Turkey. How do they bargain? Do they seek more F-16 modernization, F-5 from the United States? Very difficult to tell, but certainly put itself in a position where it can get more for the West as a price of letting Finland and Sweden into NATO.
Because right now, Turkey has only made body shopping from Finland and Sweden for its Kurdish rebels, mostly.
Yeah.
And Putin and Russia, you see, even if Russia were to destroy all of Ukraine and win, like Emperor Ashoka, the Battle of Kalinga, he wins the battle, but nobody's left alive. Even if that were to happen, would Russia emerge a much weaker country, or is there a situation in which Russia can emerge a stronger power?
I think clearly one needs to begin the answer to that question to say that I don't think Russia can win this war. And there will come a time in 7 or 8 weeks, perhaps a bit earlier, perhaps a bit later, when they decide that they've done about as much as they can now, and then they call for a ceasefire. And then the question will be the division in the West, because there will be countries that will say this ceasefire is fraudulent both in form and in substance. It's just a mechanism for the Russians to allow themselves to regroup. And then there'll be others who will say, look, we need to accept the ceasefire and at least bring a pause to the conflict. So this drama of how Russia tries to win from a losing position will demand a lot of unity from the West, which is perhaps a bit fragile. What's clear is that Russia has lost a huge amount of its combat power. Even if you take the lower end of the Western predictions and eliminate some of the Ukraine estimates, we're talking about a phenomenal amount of tanks and planes and artillery pieces and 25,000 persons lost, a huge defeat in that sense. And the real goal of the West should be to ensure that at least Russia cannot try this again. And that's why you heard Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense of the United States, say 4 or 5 weeks ago, it sounded a little bit ambitious to say, we must make certain that Russian conventional power is so reduced they couldn't attack a neighbor again. They probably won't be able to do so for another decade or 15 years if the current trends are followed.
Yeah. So the war again, where is Russian air power? Where is Russian air power?
The fantastic thing is that 5 months into this war, neither Ukraine nor Russia have air superiority.
Absolutely.
So that's an impressive detail. They've just not been able to develop air superiority, and it looks like they weren't given the increase of weaponry that's going in, including airplanes in time that will be coming in to replace those that the Ukrainians have lost in this battle. So this will be an attritional war until the Russians are exhausted and decide to sue for a ceasefire, but that won't mean a peace.
But why couldn't Russian Air Force have just simply overwhelmed the Ukrainians in the first 3, 4, 5 days, taken the casualties, and then controlled the skies? Why did that not happen?
Well, it appeared that they genuinely didn't have the capability or the preparedness for it. They didn't think that air superiority was necessary in order to win the land campaign that they thought would more instantly be won. And by the time they came to the view that air superiority would be useful, there was enough air defenses and counter-air capacities of the Ukrainians to deny them air superiority. But neither of the two principal combatants controlled the air.
Yeah. So does it tell us something about Russian equipment, particularly aviation equipment?
It tells you, I think, probably more about the combined arms capacities. I think one of the things that the United States and NATO forces pride themselves on is their ability to combine naval power, air power, land power, obviously nowadays even cyber power for kinetic effect in a way that is organized. They weren't even communicating with themselves across secure channels. And this inability to do a combined exercise was in an actual war, I think surprised some, but reveals some flaws of Russian doctrine that were never really needed to be exercised in their previous campaigns, including the recent one in Syria.
Yeah. So I have Major General Sharaf Pachauri, who wants to know how is the Ukraine war likely to affect China's BRI project, given that most of the project is based on land routes passing through Central Asian republics, on which Russia exercises significant control. And while you answer that, I will alert you to the next one. Where is Kazakhstan headed?
Well, I can answer both together in a way. I was fascinated to see President Tokayev on stage with President Putin a few weeks ago at the St. Petersburg Economic Summit, to which Western and other financiers regularly used to go, saying that he had no intention to recognize the independence of the republics of in eastern Ukraine, and refuting Putin on stage, despite the fact that some months beforehand, Putin had delivered forces into Kazakhstan to quell an internal rebellion that could have gotten quite serious for President Tokayev. It looks like Tokayev is beginning to slowly detach himself from President Putin. He certainly doesn't want to find himself in the same position as President Lukashenko of Belarus, where he's been politically, economically, and militarily colonized by Putin. So I think Kazakhstan is going to try to assert a little bit more, to use this phrase, its own strategic autonomy now, and its own strategic personality a great deal more. And I don't know whether President Putin really has the diplomatic, military, or economic wherewithal to keep all of these Central Asian states loyal to his Central Asian supremacy or defer to his opinion on all things. Look, the Belt and Road Initiative is complex, hugely expensive, has had its ups and downs. From the IISS point of view, we're at least as interested in the digital Silk Road that China is pursuing, because while many people are dazzled by things like the acquisition through a 99-year lease of the port in Colombo that, of course, caused so much problems for the Rajapaksa's, who have now, escaped from Sri Lanka after a people's rebellion. The fact is that it's the digital Silk Road, which is the important technology of the future, and that we at the IISS have developed a product called China Connects that tracks through 7,500 data points, the 5G, the e-commerce, the fiber optic cabling and the like that China has provided for so many countries in Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and Latin America. And I think for India and others to follow the digital Silk Road of China is even more important than looking at the Belt and Road Initiative and these more conventional routes of transport and movement.
Will you tell us a little bit more about this digital Silk Road?
Yes, I think what China's broad goal is that it has it is a data superpower now. But it's a data superpower with its own population of whatever it might be, 1.3 and 1.4 billion people. But it's a very homogeneous data set. And if you're really going to apply artificial intelligence in a way that can support your geopolitical goals in the future, you need a more heterodox data set. And to a degree, that data set is acquirable if China has inroads with 40 African states, 7 or 8 Latin American ones, a fleet of Middle Eastern ones, where they're providing the 5G, the fiber optic cabling, the e-commerce, the e-government. Many countries in the world have signed all sorts of contracts with the Chinese, perhaps not sensitive to the data security implications. And I think China's perception is that the future of the world is data, the future of the world is technology, the future of the world is AI and surveillance. And I think it's that digital Silk Road of China, which it has throughout the world, including in Europe, that is important. If you look even at Deutsche Telekom in Germany, half of their own network is Chinese equipment. And so this appeal that the Trump administration made a few years ago to disentangle the West from Chinese technology is going to be very expensive and difficult. And our assessment is that only about 15% of the contracts in Europe then Secretary of State Pompeo was campaigning against have actually been cancelled. So that digital Silk Road will give China some enduring influence in a number of geographies.
See, we always learn a new thing talking with John Chipman. So I will, on this note, I also make not at all, and I'm not at all embarrassed making this plug. I will make a solid plug for IISS. So people take a membership. It doesn't cost that much money in a year, but this is the best knowledge you can get. All of this will come online. You will also get hard copies, not just about military affairs. Strategic now go way beyond military affairs. So when you study strategic affairs now, then you get access to something like China Connect, and you learn about the digital road. And I understand the anxieties now better that a lot of the countries are having, governments are having about their own data and the relationships with the Chinese. John, on that note, Pia Krishnan Kuti, she's one of my young colleagues, and she also does twice a week feature called World 360. So she wants, in fact, her latest one is on Kaliningrad, and she also taught me what is a semi-exclave. right? So her question is, what do you make of China's silence on the Ukraine war? Does it indicate a sense of worry?
Well, first of all, let me say that we in Europe pay an awful lot of attention to anything that Shekhar Gupta writes, and I would love to be able to condense into 50 words the many ideas that you are able to edit yourself in that way. So let me at least throw the compliment back and thank you for all the wise words that you have for us to better understand not just your country, but your region. I think China is perturbed by the Ukraine war. It's no great advantage to it to see Russia having these sorts of difficulties. And they also worry about the sanctions regime because they are concerned that they might be subject to ancillary sanctions before they're completely strategically and economically and financially autonomous. So I think this concern that Russia and China will be pushed together, as some people have in some parts of the world, is a little bit exaggerated. There's a wonderful travel book written by Colin Thubrun about the Amur River, where he 2 years ago traveled the whole length of the Amur River, which, as you know, begins in Mongolia and then snakes its way as between China and Russia and eventually decants itself into the sea near Vladivostok. And as you see the sentiments that are expressed of Chinese nationals and Russian nationals on either side of the border, you learn very quickly that there's no love lost between the Russians and the Chinese, that the Russians hugely resent the relative economic success of the Chinese and worry about Chinese influence in their large eastern part of their own country. So I think the Chinese are concerned about this war. They're looking at it obviously a little bit from the perspective of their own interest to one day reunite with Taiwan. But they're not celebrating this attack on the West, which Putin has done in a strategically illiterate way.
So the question from me, and I'll also add a question by my colleague, our diplomatic editor, Nainama Basu, which is, to what extent do you hold China responsible for some of the crises in our neighborhood, India's neighborhood, Sri Lanka, and to an extent also Pakistan, because Pakistan is never going to be able to repay the CPEC loans?
No, well, I agree. I mean, in the early days of the Belt and Road Initiative, famously, the judgment was this might be the biggest debt for equity swap in world economic history. At the same time, one wonders whether all the equity that China might gain from this is equity that it actually wishes. So there's a balance that even the Chinese, I think, are having carefully to look at. And I'm sure there are many in China who think that China is overextended on its Belt and Road Initiative, and it's maybe done far too much in this area, and that might become all the stronger in Chinese domestic sentiment as its economy struggles to keep up with the pace of its so-called dynamic COVID policy, which has clearly limited growth in China. But there's no question that the extraordinarily poor deal that the Rajapaksa's made with the Chinese was a conditioned precedent for the horrific economic situation in which Sri Lanka finds itself, and that has resulted in this people power overturning of at least the presidency. And as for Pakistan, it's so difficult to judge. I think under this government, they might well be a little bit more cautious, and yet they have few other places in which they can turn in order to get the economic assistance that they so regularly seek.
Yeah. So our second question is, India now has two quads, one Indo-Pacific and other in the Middle East. So she wants to know, that's called I2U2. Sounds sort of like the name of a rock group. Both deny having a security dimension to them. What do you think is the utility of such groupings? Do they not create a further complex web of geopolitics, giving rise to more tensions? Or, as I will now add to this, as the Chinese say, creating new gangs against China?
Well, I think the broad assessment has to be that when very large alliances are difficult to maintain and when strategic autonomy is too hard to achieve, you end up with these various minilateral arrangements. And I suppose it's very consistent with India's multi-alignment strategy of recent years to find all sorts of things which the Chinese would call small circles that it can safely inhabit to ensure the diversity of its strategic links. I agree with you that this most recent one of the US and the UAE and India and Israel is quite an interesting gathering. Whether it will have much strategic legs to it, I don't know, but I'm sure the Indian view will be that the more the merrier in terms of these sort of small groupings that give it an insight. And I think this is the key point for India, to give it an insight into the strategic thinking of a variety of different partners, and to be present with the United States, Israel, and the United Arab Emirates in these sorts of discussions, no doubt adds to the sort of diplomatic intelligence gathering that a large country like India should be doing in order to be able to comport itself on the world stage. So I find these minilateral arrangements interesting. I don't put too much emphasis on them. I don't think they all have defense or strategic consequences that are major, but they diversify India's diplomatic linkages at a time when strategic hedging is all the rage.
The most interesting takeaway that I found in this I2U2 statements is this $2.2 billion UAE investment in agricultural parks in India with technology and expertise from the US and Israel. So I see this as the first instance of a sizable foreign direct investment into Indian agriculture. And this is not investment as in equity that will be taken out. This is money coming in. And there is a statement from Joe Biden that says India has great farming strength. And with this, in 5 years, India's farm output can be tripled. Now that Indian agriculture to be acknowledged as a kind of strategic asset is interesting and new, isn't it?
It is, but it's something also that the United Arab Emirates in particular has always been keen on, because they have this huge sensitivity to the issues of food security. They don't have land. India has land. Pakistan has land. Sudan has land. Thailand has land. The Gulf countries has often looked to have joint agricultural ventures with countries that have land when they have so little of it. And there's always been in the UAE-Israel relationship that has developed since the Abraham Accords were signed last year, a sense that this was an area, agricultural technology, where the two could, for their own benefit, collaborate. So it's not surprising to me, but you're right that it's an innovative element of this special relationship, if one can call it that.
And Yair Lapid, he's smart because he's a former journalist. I had to say that. He talked about a food corridor between India and UAE, which I thought was quite interesting. Now, last two questions. One from my young colleague Raghav Bikhchandani, who reads you on Twitter, who says on Twitter today, that's just today, so be accountable. On Twitter today, you flagged the issue of Bulgaria and Romania's Black Sea boundaries being more vulnerable than ever to Russian Navy. Do you think NATO is thus far relatively unconcerned about the issue? What would your plan be for Romania and Bulgaria?
Well, thank you very much for making me accountable, and I'm delighted to be accountable for that particular tweet. It was really teasing the NATO Secretary General a little bit, who every day in the last 4 or 5 months has said that NATO will defend every inch of NATO territory, something that Joe Biden has said also with great passion as a real lover of the NATO alliance. But they've been thinking about land territory. And so I'm only just reminding you through this tweet that there's maritime territory as well. And right now, Romania and Bulgaria, with Turkey, 3 NATO member states, cannot be certain that their coastal boundaries are 100% secure, given the freedom of movement that the Black Sea Fleet of Russia has given to itself. And so it's a way of hinting that we should be a little bit more ambitious in finding a way to reopen the Black Sea in the interest of our NATO partners, certainly, but even more, as I said earlier, in the interest of global security, global food security, and the global South. So I want those keys to the Black Sea to be opened, and for us not to be content with just saying, "Oh, Russia closed it. There's nothing we can do."
Yeah. So since we talked food just now, what will be your guess? 2 weeks from now, 3 weeks from now, or at some point, do you see this Ukrainian wheat or Ukrainian grain and sunflower oil being evacuated or not?
A proportion of it will come now that so much work is being done to try to transport it by rail or through the Danube or the like. But really, it will require one of two things to happen: either that the UN, Russia, Ukraine, and Turkey agree on an international mission to do this, or that a small coalition of Western states, maybe acting with one or two other non-Western states, decide to develop their own humanitarian mission to go in, demine, and escort the grain out.
But something will happen.
I hope something will happen, because if it doesn't, it would really be a tragedy. And I think we have a responsibility in Europe to be more strategically agile in finding a way to reopen the Black Sea. And with the use of force, if necessary, humanitarian force. Again, I just don't think that if we were to deploy for that single humanitarian mission, that Russia would see cause to sink a ship that was simply escorting grain out.
Because Ukrainians are saying that they will have a fresh crop coming out now, and they have no place to store it, so they might have to burn this grain if they can't evacuate it.
And Ukraine has been the most important single supplier of wheat to the world, and fertilizer, which is also important. And
fertilizer, also important for India. Now, last two questions. One, Germany. Are you surprised by what a weak link Germany has been in this European unity?
Well, Germany, of course, was shocked at the war. And the SPD Chancellor Olaf Scholz comes from a party that had always sought to have very good relations with Russia and with Putin in particular. The Germans have always been very attached to various diplomatic formula, the Minsk Accord or the Normandy formats that helped to regulate this conflict in Ukraine. All that was shattered by the Russian invasion. So the big change has been the cash infusion, that Germany has decided that it will add 100 billion euros to its defense, and that it will move to the 2% NATO standard of defense expenditure, which, by the way, would make Germany the third biggest defense spender in the world after the US and China. But they haven't yet adapted their strategic culture to that cash infusion. So there's still not an understanding in the new German strategic mindset as to how that newly empowered military force might be used. And so this has been a difficult time for Germany. And I think Germany, France, and Italy are the three European countries that would most prefer a diplomatic settlement, even if Ukrainian sovereignty were partly compromised, whereas the United States, the United Kingdom, all the Baltic states, the Eastern European states would refuse that. And this would be a fourth Chipmanism, if I'm allowed this for this program, which is that in Europe, the geopolitical center of gravity has moved to the east and to the north. It's the Eastern Europeans, the Baltics, the Swedes, the Finns, the Norwegians that are now making the strategic running. And I think that Western Europeans over the next decade will need to speak of Nordic centrality in European security in the same way that we now defer to ASEAN centrality when we talk about Asian security architectures.
Well, that's excellent. And finally, who are you voting for Prime Minister in Britain?
Of course, like any good citizen, I never publicly talk about my own vote. What I would say is you have 5 candidates who today will be debating again, and we won't know for another few days. On July 21st, 2 will go to the Conservative Party. And of course, the party is a very particular electorate. And so it's very hard to predict who will win until we see who the two finalists are. But what we know is on September 5th, we'll have a new British Prime Minister, and we hope that will be a British Prime Minister that will want to have very strong relations with the Republic of India.
Well, that of course, and John Chipman, you will be there dispensing wisdom all the time. And I know that under you, IISS has really expanded its India engagement. So please do keep at it. And thank you very much once again for your time and your patience and for your Chipmanisms.
And Shekhar Gupta, thank you very much for all of your intellectual assistance to our work at the IISS over 3 decades.
Wonderful, John. See you again soon.
Thank you.
The Print Off The Cuff, presented by IIFL Wealth and Asset Management, corporate partner AU Small Finance Bank, airline partner SpiceJet.